this time I will deal with the idea, and um, well, there are two different notions one should at first think of, and the first notion is theory, and the second notion is um, well, perhaps I need a better notion for that, because every logical deduction has as a basic, or on a certain to a certain extent, something rather axiomatic to it. To give an example, let's say, I don't know. Normally it's something quite easy to say, this is a pencil, and if I let it fall like this, it falls because I opened my hand, and therefore it couldn't remain where it remains because of gravity and so on. You can make a bunch of explanations. But as some parents might know, I am not a parent, but I guess they know, if one would always ask why does it happen, the explanation will always go a bit further and further and further towards a point where you have something axiomatic. Like, let's say we talk about the pencil. The first thing would be gravity. Fine. What's about gravity? Why is it gravity, one might ask? Well, then one might say it's because objects have a certain gravity and we live on an object and so on. But then one might ask, why do we live on an object, and how does it happen? And then most people would have some trouble to explain it. And if you then know perhaps actual physics and say that there are not quantum particles, but of course there's the dimension of the quarks, and there are gravitons which are really small particles which actually cause, in a way, gravity. But the point is, every time, of course, now one could ask, well, how do they do it? And then one would get another explanation. But at a certain point, also in simple logical deduction, like all people are, all humans are will die. Aristotle is a human, so he will die. There is always something rather axiomatic in it, which, for example, in this, I guess this Aristotle example would be easier in a way, and a better example actually. And one might say, well, of course all people die, but how do one really deduce from all people will die that Aristotle will die? And on that account, it's basically how do you call it? A formalism. In a way, it's a kind of formalism to say that this will happen out of logical deduction. And one might ask, well, why this formalism? And well, at at the end, even the formalism is another theory. So formalism and theory are, well, one could say every formalism is a theory in a way, and every theory is grounded in its basics on formalism, and that's something quite interesting actually. And well, I hope you get it. Oh, of course, one could name this kind of thing formalism, but now as one sees the connection, I guess one might find it useful in ordinary life, because often one tends to find oneself in arguments, and uh, in a way at a certain point uh, you say something but people tend to ignore your argument, and you really can't help actually. But if you know that formalism and theory are so linked together in the way I just described it, then one might find a good solution to answer to such kind of irrational criticism. Well, often it comes with religious people, such arguments, but don't want to go into it. And there might be a person who thinks I'm talking of her, but actually what she's doing is not that bad, and she shouldn't worry. But okay. And the next thing would be, of course, simplification. And now one might ask, how is formalism, simplification, and theory linked to one another? Every formalism is in a way a theory, and every theory grounds on formalism. But on the account of why a particular formalism functions and not another, or why one shouldn't in a way be too much into questioning one's, basically this goes into the wrong direction. One should question one's formalisms, whether they are one's own or generally agreed upon. But at the end of it, it's always a question of usefulness. Is a certain theoretical standpoint useful, or is a certain kind of formalism useful to make some good claims with it? And simplification, of course, is on the side of choosing the ones which work, the formalism which works, the theory which works. And, well, that's basically the point, I think. And, of course, one could make a proof in a way. Not a proof actually, but I could explain why simplification is inherent to, well, I will explain why simplification is inherent to formalism and to theory. And of course, the question is also what kind of simplification. While explaining it, the kind of simplification I am talking about will be more clearly, I think. Of course, one might, Well, it's followingly. If one wouldn't simplify, a formalism w- would just, the concept of the formalism would have no end in a way. It will go from particularity to another particularity. Like if one says that a certain logic applies to one object but not to another. Of course, there are, for example, the logic of liquidity. If one says that stuff is liquid, I'm not talking about banking. That the stuff is liquid won't work in if you deal with steel under, I don't know, 2000 degrees. But that's not the point. The same logical rules applies to steel or to water to that extent, and this is what I'm trying to getting to. And with theory, it's in a way similar. If you tend to have explanation for things which make the thing harder than it is, well, one should prefer in a way the simpler solution than the harder solution, but which has the same representative power as the harder solution. And okay, this will be a bit religion bashing to that extent, but for example, saying that, I don't know, saying that the Bible, for example, is true, and to say that evolution and all these things didn't happen is in a way to prefer the harder solution, because you need a bunch of things which are neither seeable nor sensible nor in any way comprehensible for other people than Christians towards explaining something. But if you just take what is actually there and explain things on ground of that, then it's pretty simple. Well, it's not just pretty simple, but actually evolution isn't a kind of new idea which science came upon. It's a quite old idea, and it didn't actually start with Darwin. I think it even started in the Muslim world, and unfortunately I really don't know which philosopher actually came up with it, but it's quite interesting. One might perhaps credit the idea of evolution to this guy than to Darwin. But also I'm not actually aware to which extent his theory of evolution worked. This is because I think he didn't got actually this natural selection right. But to a certain extent, natural selection is too important for the theory of evolution to say, well, he didn't get it right, but to say he didn't get it right, but he somehow managed to have his theory of evolution. But of course, one should check it up if one has time. But actually, it's not that important because, well, it wouldn't hurt you if you just learned evolution from Darwin and you know that it applies usually. This was my last video on this appearance stuff, and my next videos will be more open. Bye.